In 1984, road crews constructing Interstate 70 dug into a large hillside in Clear Creek Canyon in Sevier County, Utah. The road crews were using the dirt and gravel of the hill for the road base of the highway. While plowing, road crews discovered the remnants of a large Fremont village, and highway work stalled while archaeologists could survey and record the site. Previous archaeological surveys had been done around the canyon, but the findings at Five Finger Ridge remain one of the most prolific in Fremont archaeology. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, the rules for preserving sites were not as strict as today, and the hill eventually succumbed to the bulldozers building the interstate highway. Less than half of the hillside remains, while the rest is now road base. Fortunately, the unique nature of the find led to the establishment of Fremont Indian State Park, or FISP, the construction of a museum and visitor center, and full-time maintenance by state and national park employees who help preserve the petroglyphs and remaining artifacts. The Fremont Indians were the indigenous Native Americans occupying the territory now known as Utah between about 300 and 1350 CE. The Fremont complex, as this culture is often termed, is identified by their pottery, a plain grayware, their unique moccasins made from the lower leg hide of large game animals, their pit houses, circular domiciles with a round opening at the top, and their rock art, stylized figures with a unique trapezoidal torso. The Fremont fished and hunted local wildlife, including rabbit, turkey, and deer, and they gathered wild berries and plants. Most Fremont villages practiced agriculture and primarily grew corn. It appears farm products were available to all, however, through a network of trade. The origins of the Fremont are unclear. One leading theory suggests that the Fremont peoples came up from the Pueblo complexes of the Southwest. By the late 14th century, Fremont settlements had been abandoned, and the Fremont culture disappeared. Leading theories suggest that a mixture of climate change, migrations, and perhaps warfare or other social pressures led to the migration of the Fremont peoples out of the territory of present-day Utah. I am a founding board member of the Utah Valley Astronomy Club, a 501c3 nonprofit that partners with state and national parks, as well as schools and other public organizations, to help run their astronomy programs. In May of 2017, I was invited to help run a star party hosted by Fremont Indian State Park. While attending the festivities for the star party with my son Jacob, we hiked through the pathways of FISP, noting the numerous petroglyphs carved across the large rock bluffs that form the park. Quite by accident, we approached one petroglyphic panel just at the right time. A shadow was cast upon it by the rock protrusion above it, and I watched the shadow slowly move upwards as I observed the petroglyph. This phenomenon only occurs a few hours each day throughout the summer months. Further, this petroglyph caught my eye because it was very different than the others I had seen. This petroglyph is a very large geometric form anchored by a large sunwheel motif and composed of several different and interrelated symbols and dots. Within a few minutes, I found myself counting the dots and lines of the petroglyph. The first thing that stood out was the sunwheel motif divided into 12 wedges. One of the wedges has 11 lines carved into it. When counting these lines, the hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I perhaps have two advantages over the average tourist viewing these petroglyphs. One, I am an amateur astronomer, and two, I hold a doctorate in comparative myth and religious traditions from Pacifica Graduate Institute out of California. I've spent years studying ancient oral traditions, and I know that most oral cultures keep exact lunar calendars. Agrarian cultures also keep solar calendars. In fact, I became an amateur astronomer during my graduate studies because I kept running into cosmological motifs embedded in the cultures and religions of antiquity, and I needed a framework to understand these motifs. Over the years of study, I have become convinced that oral cultures, cultures without writing, used the natural landscape as part of a mnemonic storehouse, and the sky itself served as a sort of printing press for oral minds. Oral peoples encode certain memories onto the stars, sun, and moon, so that when they rise in certain configurations, the society is informed as to when to perform certain rituals, tell certain myths, and perform cultural functions associated with their agriculture, hunting, as well as other concerns. As an amateur astronomer who studies ancient cultures, I knew that most cultures keep a lunar calendar based off the synodic month. A synodic month is 29.5 days and is the time it takes for the moon to go through all its phases: new, waxing crescent, full, and waning crescent. The math is very simple. The difference between 12 synodic lunar months and one solar year is 11 days. Could the sun wheel motif be displaying a lunar year in its 12 wedges that is being reconciled with a solar year in those 11 lines? At the time of my first observation of this petroglyph, I knew nothing of the Fremont or the rock art. But within a few minutes of first seeing this petroglyph with its sun shadow, I hypothesized the following. 1. The sun wheel of 12 wedges and 11 lines was a solar lunar count. The 12 wedges each represented one lunar month, while the 11 lines represented the difference in days between a synodic lunar year and one solar year. 2. The shadow probably was incorporated into the design of the petroglyph, and as it moved across the rock face, it may have indicated when to start a ritual cycle that was part of the Fremont calendar. 3. The calendar was probably oriented towards the summer solstice. Though in oral cultures, both the summer and winter solstices hold supreme cosmological and religious functions, and therefore the glyph may have been utilized in ways that predicted the entire solar year. 4. I could be wrong on all of the above. Knowing the time, energy, not to mention the cost, of studying this glyph and testing my hypotheses would be great, I had no real inclination to start a study to try to prove or disprove my thesis. However, I had an experience elsewhere in this canyon that was quite profound, and I will talk about that in another video. But this experience would not leave me alone. And a few weeks after my star party at Fremont Indian State Park, I decided to make a formal study of at least a couple of the sites in the park. The first thing I did was contact a friend and associate, John McHugh, who is a trained archaeologist, has spent time on digs in Petra in Syria, and served as a contract archaeologist in Utah for 4 years. He holds a master's in Near Eastern Studies, but has also studied Southwestern archaeology and ethnology for years. I asked John to be on my newly formed research team, which, at the moment, included me and him if he would accept. He did, and already McHugh has discovered some amazing things in this park. One discovery we made together, and it changed the entire way I view all the petroglyphs. Several more trips to the canyon, and I have uncovered something that is simple, elegant, and yet grand in its conceptual scope of heaven and earth. On June 5th of 2018, John McHugh and I were hiking the Rim Trail at Fisp. The Rim Trail is a long, narrow, and sometimes precarious path that clings to the rock face at the western end of the canyon. The rock face itself faces southwest to west towards the setting sun and serves as an ancient canvas for hundreds of petroglyphs. At about 10 a.m., we turned a bend in the trail and witnessed a rather astonishing sight. A line of sunlight was descending upon a rock face covered in petroglyphs. The rock itself had two panels set at almost 90 degrees. The left panel was just coming out of shadow in the morning light. What astounded us was the line of light and shadow that moved across the rock bisected the petroglyph images at key points. Both of us froze in silence as we watched the phenomenon. We returned the next 2 days with time-lapse cameras to capture the image. It takes about an hour for the shadow to surrender to the sunlight on the left panel, and only about 30 minutes for the sun-shadow phenomenon to transect the petroglyphs. I am again reminded just how lucky we were to witness this event. Had McHugh and I crossed this path 15 minutes earlier, the rock face would have been too much in shadow to notice anything. And had we been there 20 minutes later, the rock face would have been doused in sunlight. We arrived just at the right time to see what needed to be seen. This is exactly what happened with my son and I at the Sunwheel Petroglyph, and so far, I have been the recipient of a great deal of good luck. We have named this panel on the Rim Trail the Sheep Spiral Petroglyph because of this large, gorgeous, rectangular sheep image carrying a spiral upon its back. There are hundreds of sheep petroglyphs in this canyon. It doesn't take long to notice that many of the sheep are very different from each other, and that the sheep images themselves often are representing something other than sheep. We are dealing with a lost lexicon of symbols relating to the Fremont culture. The sheep spiral stands out to me as a deeply cosmological motif. The large rectangular body is the first hint that we are dealing with a measured and defined space. In most ancient mythologies, the world is often square or rectangular, not because of primitive conceptions, but because the world in oral cultures is defined by the sacred year as seen with observational astronomy. The sunrise and sunsets of summer and winter solstices define the rectangular world. This image also bears 7 loops on its back end, and the number 7 is also a cosmological number, often referring to the sevens seen in the sky, such as the 7 moving luminaries or the 7 stars of the Big Dipper, which are ubiquitously utilized in oral cultures as religious and calendar entities. And of course, the rectangular sheep has this gorgeous spiral emerging from its back, and again the numerous circles and spirals seen amongst the petroglyphs are most often cosmological symbols dealing with the sacred cycle of time and life as demarcated by the changing seasons and moving celestial luminaries. Finally, the large ram's head is connected to a smaller sheep that itself stands atop a square field with 3 loops. The two images are connected both literally and symbolically, and they seem to indicate the continual cycle of the recreation of the world. Of course, the Fremont left no writing, save for these petroglyphs. And the interpretation of petroglyphs outside of their ancient context is a hazardous venture indeed. Whatever the meaning the Fremont imbued upon these images, it is the images themselves, carved on the rock face as they are, that interests me. What amazed McHugh and I as we watched the sun-shadow line descend upon this rock face was the fact that the petroglyphic images themselves had been carved on the stone in accordance with the sun shadow line. A closer look reveals an anthropomorphic figure with feathers leaning towards the sheep and a large series of 12 concentric circles. When the sun shadow line falls between the feathers of the deity, it touches the edge of the large concentric circles and at the same time bisects the spiral on the back of the rectangular sheep. The petroglyphic placement is not random, but purposefully aligned with the moving sun. As the sun shadow line continues to fall, it bisects the center of the large concentric circles and falls right between the large and smaller rectangular rams, while the upper part of the shadow bisects another circular glyph above. The entire panel of images has been carved onto the rock face using the sun shadow line as the template for the size and placement of each petroglyph. A year prior, I had been with my son as we witnessed a shadow move across the sunwheel petroglyph. I had thought that the shadow was part of a calendar implement and that the Fremont were using it to help predict summer solstice. But watching the sheep spiral phenomenon made me rethink the scenario. A further observation started a new line of deliberation altogether. Right above and to the right of the sunwheel petroglyph is a rock face also covered in images. One is very interesting. It is a large panel that has a natural crack in the lower left corner. The rock above the crack sticks out over the rock below the crack. I have noticed that the Fremont used natural fissures in the stone as part of their petroglyphic designs. In this case, the images in the lower portion below the fissure contain what appears to be a domed house covered in dots, analogous to stars, while a series of solar-like discs circle above it. The image reminded me of the mythological house beneath the sun in the starry underworld. The idea of the underworld stuck with me, because when the sunlight first hits this rock face, everything below the fissure stays in shadow, and the first rays of the sun, shown here in yellow, begin to illuminate the upper part of the panel. Standing front and center in the upper panel is a trapezoidal anthropomorphic deity. Below his arms are two horizontal lines, and below his feet is another horizontal line as well as a series of horizontal counting dots. About an hour before the sun shadow phenomenon starts appearing on the sunwheel petroglyph, the sunlight hits this figure first. The sunlight falls at a slanted angle, and from the point of view standing in front of and looking at the image, the light first appears on the left of the figure, lining up with the left end of the horizontal line and the left arm. The light also touches the top left corner of the figure's head. Meanwhile, another shaft of light appears at the fissure and slowly climbs up towards the bottom of the figure. As the light moves to the right, it touches the right end of the horizontal line below the left arm and bisects the deity's head. The lower shaft of light climbs up and touches the left end of the right horizontal line. Finally, the sunlight touches the right end of the right line, the bottom of the right arm, and the far right side of the head. The lower light also touches the first of the counting dots. The entire phenomenon takes about 90 minutes to occur. Like the sunwheel petroglyph, this phenomenon only happens during the summer months. More important, while more subtle than the sheep spiral panel, the anthropomorphic deity has been carved according to the sun shadow lines that fall upon it. In fact, the two horizontal lines below the arms seem to be framing the figure according to the sunlight angles that move across the rock face. The image is being analogized to the summer sun. Meanwhile, the sun-wheel petroglyph is incorporated to the sun-shadow spectacle that falls upon it during the summer. I do surmise that the sun shadow lines on the rock face are not only being used to help predict the summer solstice, but, in my view, also incorporates the cosmology of the entire Fremont cultural calendar. More on that in another video. But all this is secondary. Like the sun deity panel above it and the sheep spiral panel, the light and shadow on this petroglyph are primarily being used as the fundament of sacred rock art methodology. There is a tradition that the petroglyphs were animated to the people who created them. The images of gods, animals, and symbols were a living cosmos, pouring beneficent powers over the tribe that served them. We modern people consider this primitive thinking, but we have forgotten that in oral cultures, analytical thinking is replaced with analogical thinking. If object A is similar in some way to object B, then the two objects are not only related, but may be symbiotic. Ancient astrology, for example, was not the nascent musings of religious fantasy, but the sophisticated considerations of analogical thinking. The point is, how does an oral people create a living image of the divine? I contend that the Fremont did it by analogically carving their rock art according to the template of the sun in its cyclical seasons. They carefully watched the sun shadow lines fall upon the rock and engraved their sacred images in size and proportion to the living light that moved upon the canvas of earth. In this way, the image was imbued with the power of object A, the sun, sky, and seasons, so that object B, the petroglyphs, became a breathing embodiment of the living cosmos. The petroglyphs are not just random rock art. The Fremont incorporated the living sunlight, shadow, and even natural fissures in rock as part of their rock art methodology. In this way, the petroglyphs reflect the grand cosmic scheme. In a very real way, Fremont rock art is the visual equivalent of written scripture. In an oral culture, the Word is the living iconography of the breathing world. The realization that at least some of the petroglyphs are aligned according to the sun shadow lines that move upon the rock face produces a series of tantalizing questions. For starters, is this methodology applied to all the hundreds of petroglyphs in this canyon? Discovering the truth of this would take thousands of observation hours running throughout the year. Furthermore, some of the rock faces have eroded. Others have cracked and broken away. The original sun shadow lines have been obliterated by time, making the determination of this methodology on some of the panels problematic to perhaps impossible. And then there is the question as to whether this methodology applies to all Fremont rock art at multiple sites through the state of Utah and beyond. Of course, the light of the full moon also casts stark shadows in this canyon. Could some of the petroglyphs be aligned to moonlight? The moon generally rises and sets within 5 degrees north or south of the sun, but the moon itself goes through a large cycle on the horizon. Further, the sun would retrace the moon in its movement across the sky, matching the nighttime shadows. Determining a moon shadow line for lunar petroglyphs may be impossible. Also, there is the consideration that maybe I am just seeing things and all this is coincidental. Ironically, there's enough modern graffiti on the petroglyphs to make comparisons. Watching the sun shadow lines move across the petroglyphs and the modern scrawlings carved over them has proved to me, beyond doubt, that the Fremont did use the sun shadow lines as their rock art template, for the modern graffiti does not line up with the phenomenon, as does the petroglyphs. Still, another question imposes itself. For the light and shadow lines and angles change over the year. The examples I have mentioned thus far have all occurred during the summer months, and we have noticed these, perhaps prominent examples, only because we spend a lot more time observing in the park during the summer months. But will not this methodology apply to certain petroglyphs during the winter? John McHugh and I have divided the canyon into different observing zones. At the west end of the canyon is the rim trail, where the sheep spiral panel is carved, as well as the sunwheel petroglyph engraved on an adjacent rock bluff. As one moves east, one encounters the museum and visitor center on the north side of the highway. Behind the museum is a large rock with the walking man panel. On the south side of the highway is Five Finger Ridge. Further east is the large and impressive Arch of Art, and at the end of the canyon is perhaps the most enigmatic and stunning sight of all, the sheep shelter. It turns out that the sheep spiral and sunwheel panels align during the summer, but the Arch of Art and sheep shelter have clear petroglyph alignments to the sun shadow phenomenon during the winter. Suddenly, I have a key. Could the petroglyphs be cataloged by type and form based off their shadow alignments through the year? If petroglyphs were divided by the 4 seasons, for example, summer, fall, winter, and spring, could we catalog similarities and differences between petroglyphs based off their sun-shadow alignments? Could this give us at least a very basic baseline for interpretation? In any case, I now have more questions than I have lifetimes to answer. The work, if done properly, would take hundreds of volunteers making thousands of observation hours across hundreds of miles of very often desolate terrain. Perhaps such an initiative can be tackled in the future. For now, John McHugh and I are making our home base of operations Fremont Indian State Park. We have developed a multi-year study plan that includes the following. 1. Develop a celestial grid that demarcates the positions of sunrise and sunset, moonrise and moonset, and the luminaries of the ecliptic on the local horizons. 2. Identify observation sites. 3. Obtain permits to set up time-lapse cameras over the course of several months at some of the observation sites to record sun shadow effects on the petroglyphs. 4. Identify and catalog key petroglyph forms for comparison with both Fremont and other Native American iconography. 5. Read hundreds of articles, essays, and books on Native American culture, ethnography, archaeology, and mythology. 6. Contact the local Paiute tribe, the Utah Rock Art Research Association, as well as the archaeologists who have worked at the canyon and surrounding sites for insights and additional information. 7. Gather our data and publish findings as we go. We invite you to join our research team. You can contribute in some very simple and small ways that will have huge benefits. Here's how. 1. Teach your children and the community that ancient rock art is sacred writing and not to be touched, handled, or scrawled over. Through education, help preserve the sites. 2. Engage in learning. Visit the state and national parks and see the petroglyphs for yourselves. Fremont Indian State Park has hundreds of petroglyphs, as well as countless miles of ATV and horse trails, camping, and other fun activities. Dinosaur National Monument in Vernal, Utah also holds many petroglyphs, as well as dinosaur bones. And 3. Follow our own research on my personal website, www.johnlundwall.com. Here you can see new photos, including my astrophotography, get news updates, read blogs and papers, and watch videos like you are watching now on our project. I hope you enjoyed this video, and our research team hopes you join our quest to recover some of the lost knowledge of the ancient Fremont. I've been asked, why spend so much time and effort studying a lost and forgotten people? We human beings are constantly forgetting how little we actually know about the past, and about the present, and about ourselves. The study of the ancient Fremont will bring some surprises and maybe even a few revelations, but maybe we just might learn something about ourselves along the way. So join us, and until next time, I hope to see you at the rising of the sun.